Thanks for joining us. This is the American Values Coalition webinar. And at the American Values Coalition, we are growing a community of Americans empowered to lead with truth, reject extremism and misinformation, and defend democracy. So thank you for joining. We definitely need allies in that mission. So if you're seeing this for the first time, either live or if you're watching on YouTube and you haven't heard of us before and you want to find out more, you can visit our website. It's americanvalues.org. We are also on Twitter at Our Values NGO, and we're on Facebook at Our American Values. The topic for today's webinar is how information disorder can lead to violent extremism. And our speaker is Elizabeth Neumann. Elizabeth is former Department of Homeland Security Assistant Secretary for Counterterrorism, and now she is Chief Strategy Officer for Moonshot and also a national security contributor for ABC. And so welcome, Elizabeth Neumann.
Thanks so much for having me, Napp. And, if you wouldn't mind, I love knowing where people are from. So in the chat, if you'll just share where you're joining from, I would love to understand better your perspectives, and I can tailor my comments accordingly. And I'm gonna just flag for Dan. Can you enable my screen sharing so I can show my slides? I'm getting a message there. Sorry about that. So let me just start with, I want to cover this content in about 30 to 40 minutes. I have a lot of it. Napp knows this, and I know that I can't possibly cover everything that might be of interest to you. So if we breeze through something, let me know. Just jot down the slide number if you want to go back to it. We can do that during the Q&A, and we can go deeper. And I love that everybody's from all over: Wisconsin and Philadelphia, here in Arlington, Virginia, where I am, and Chicago. Awesome. Always love the Texas people too, because that's where I'm from. Just an overview. We're going to cover definitions of things that you've heard about: misinformation, disinformation. We're going to talk about violent extremism. We are also going to talk about radicalization, what that actually means, what that looks like, and what the research is telling us that we can do to prevent radicalization, as well as ways in which the church and believers can help in this space. And actually, that's kind of where I want to start. So let's see if I can share my screen. Still can't share my screen. Dan, is that something you can help me with?
I'm looking at it right now. You might have to press the video icon again and go to video settings, and then.
Oh, actually, I think I have the settings. Sorry.
Oh, Napp. You can do it.
Okay, is that working now?
Let's see. Drum roll. Ah, yes.
Okay.
Excellent. Okay. So let me start with the good news. I think that the church is uniquely suited for this moment. I have spent a lot of time, especially the last 2 years, lamenting and grieving. I'm sure, like many of you, I've worked in counterterrorism for 20 years, so that's saying something, but I did not expect the church to respond in the way it has over some difficult times. And I am definitely have had some dark days. And I think when I go through this, some of the feedback I get about sharing where we are as a country and what's happening from a violent extremism perspective, it can be dark. So let me start with some good news. I think that the church has an important role to play in building resilience in the community. And we'll talk about these terms, but let's do the overview first. I think sound teaching, the whole counsel of Scripture, helps people discern truth. And that is extremely important in building resilience. Having strong in real life connections to people, not Facebook friends, but actual in real life, you're doing life together. You show up when bad days happen and when good days happen. that has been shown to create resilience in people and make them less vulnerable to recruitment to extremism, as does having a sense of belonging and significance. And it's this latter piece that when I say that, if you are a pastor or you're trained in ministry, or you've just been in the church and discipled well, you understand that intuitively. Well, wait a second, the church is about belonging to the family of God. The church is about teaching people that our significance is being a child of God. It's not in our careers, it's not in our families or our kids. The significance comes from belonging to Christ. So I guess I think that the hidden secret, if you will, that the government's not going to fully understand this, the counterterrorism community is not going to fully understand this, is that the church is well positioned to minister to people that are vulnerable, and by doing what we do best, like preaching the gospel, we actually have the opportunity to build resilience and protective factors in individuals that might otherwise be vulnerable to radicalization. I think the church also has a really important role in equipping our communities. We have found, this is scientific, this is not like touchy-feely, I'm an optimist, so I want to tell you some good news. No, this is like the research. Empathy and love is the most powerful way to disengage and de-radicalize individuals. It is not arguing somebody out of the argument. Now, if somebody has not bought into the ideology yet, then inserting truth and doubt into something that they're toying with, that's important. But if somebody is already fully bought in, they're radicalized into an ideology or a conspiracy theory, you're not going to argue them out of that. The reason for it is because what we have found draws people into a radicalized belief is not the belief itself, but it's a need for belonging or a need for significance, a need to address an injustice in their life. So what counteracts that is not arguing an ideology, but rather coming alongside the individual, understanding what's going on in their life. Empathy, love, super powerful weapons. It doesn't always work. It is very messy business. But hey, isn't that what the church is about? Is working with messy sinners and allowing Christ to do the work. So I think there's an extremely important role for the church here. There are also other things the church can be doing, working with social services, mental health professionals in the community. Man, they are stretched thin right now. It has been a rough 2 years. They are super critical for providing services to those that we might have concerns about, might consider acts of violence. We want to encourage and help the parts of the community that are trying to intervene. So I think there's a role there for the church to play. It's also important, sadly, that you, members of the church, equip yourself with the information to detect signs of concern. You need to have active relationships with your local law enforcement so that you can have a conversation. If there's somebody you're working with and they are showing those signs of planning an act of violence, you need to be able to pick up the phone and have that conversation. And then just practical preparation. Unfortunately, we saw over the weekend a synagogue be attacked. That has been a key threat vector that we've been concerned about for quite some time. It is unlikely to go away. You need to have security plans, you need to have protective measures in place, and you need to drill those on a routine basis. So that's kind of what I want you to walk away with, but now let's get into some of the substance. Let's start with definitions. I'm going to pause before I turn to national security implications. And focus on these definitions, and then some important takeaways for the Christian community. Misinformation, this is just, people misunderstanding. This is not an intentional spreading of false information. It's you truly believe what the information you have is true and you share it with somebody else. That's misinformation. Disinformation is about the intentionality. Somebody has created something that's false, and they're deliberately trying to cause harm to a person or a social group or an organization or a country. This is primarily when you hear people talk about information disorder, it's the disinformation we're most concerned about. Malinformation is also an interesting category that I think the church should be able to speak to. This is accurate, true information, but it's being spread or amplified for the purpose of inflicting harm. So a common way we see this is political campaigns do opposition research, and right, so they find out the dirty laundry of some politician and then they run a campaign ad on it. Well, it's probably true, or it is true, let's suppose, and at the same time it is not necessarily for the good of the individual. And that let me take it to a Christian context. This is where going back to basics about our faith would really help us out. Let's go back to the 10 Commandments. We are told we should not bear false witness. Every single one of these things is bearing false witness in a different kind of way. We are guided by Paul to not gossip, to not slander, and instead to think on things that are true, things that are just and beautiful. I read something a couple of years ago that was like an admonition on what does it look like to bear false witness in today's day and age. And I was so convicted. And it caused me to become more careful with speculation. Like, why do we think, and look, we're supposed to be active in our country as citizens. We're absolutely able to ask questions and to challenge those in authority in an appropriate way, but it shouldn't be done through speculation, gossip, and slander. There is a healthy way to ask those questions, and then there's a where we are now, which is a large swath of our population is deep into speculation and conspiracy theories. QAnon, I'll give you as an example, celebrates this idea that government leaders, celebrities are pedophiles and Satan worshipers. Quite frankly, if any of your people are trafficking in that, now look, you're probably not, if they're really in deep, you're not going to talk them out of it. But it's also part of your role, if you're preaching the word, is to tell the truth. Like, you are trafficking in slander. You don't have firsthand information that proves that so-and-so is a pedophile. And I honestly, I would argue that many forms of criticism of the deep state are slander. That, again, you can critique your government, but I've been in the so-called swamp for 5 years. It's damaged the church's witness. The millions of people in this region that do various things for the government, like help make sure your planes fly safely, or help protect our country from Russia and China wanting to cause harm. Like those public servants, most of them, like 99% of them, they're not nefarious. Most of them are competent. There are some incompetent, but most are competent. Most are very mission driven. They're here serving. They could make a ton more money elsewhere. And half of the country, who, and many of whom bear the label of Christian or claim to be a Christian, make fun of them and make snide comments about them, and they think it's funny. And yet, if they were to walk into a church in this area, and they'd be making fun of their fellow brothers and sisters in Christ. So I would encourage you to think of creative ways to help us reorient our hearts and how we navigate. And it's a difficult media environment. It's very easy to get caught up in slander and not even realize that you're doing it. But going back to basics would really help us. Now, let's talk about the national security perspective of information disorder. Why do I care as a national security professional? Well, it's because that we know the design behind a lot of our disinformation is to break down our society. It's to radicalize us into little polarized subsections such that we can't work with each other and we don't trust each other. And honestly, the textbook case of this comes out of Russia. They've, in their active measures playbook from Soviet Union days, Cold War days, they did this. and they've just updated it for the information age and are able to do it quite successfully. We know the US government has published declassified and unclassified reports that the aim of Russia and other enemies like them is to use disinformation to sow discord. They want to so weaken our resolve so that as a society, we're too wrapped up in infighting that we wouldn't be able to have the resolve to push back against them if they wanted to do something. I don't know, like invade Ukraine or China invading Taiwan. Now you can have your foreign policy decision, viewpoints on what we should do about that, but it's rather concerning to me to watch. We've had national security professionals predicting they are doing this so that we are so weakened that we won't be unified when we need to be unified, and we're now kind of at the doorstep of one of those moments. And we are pretty weak. We do not find a way to offer the benefit of the doubt to the other side or grace to the other side that maybe they're trying to do the right thing, even if you disagree with it. We have so demonized the other side that we can't even have a productive conversation on national security threats. So two other key points on here. You have some quotes from the National Intelligence Council. They do long-term assessments, like look 20 years in advance and kind of give you a picture of what are the types of threats that we might need to be concerned about. One of their 6 key geopolitical trends and technology changes was mis and disinformation taking over objective truth. And they project that unless something comes in and regulates that, we are increasing the risk of major power kinetic conflict. And to be clear, kinetic conflict is not the Cold War. Kinetic conflict is World War II experience or World War I experience. This is not, they do not write that lightly. So when you are confronting disinformation in your community, with your family, and quite frankly, I've had this myself, it is very easy to be like, all right, like this is too hard. You go your way, I'll go my way. Keep in mind that the consequences of this running rampant in our society are more than just that one individual relationship. So working to try to combat this has pretty consequential implications for us. We talked about the importance of societal, or that the purpose of disinformation is societal breakdown. Here's some examples of why we have recently seen evidence of societal breakdown. We have trust at an all-time low, increased hate crimes, increased terrorist attacks. And that's in the midst of, by the way, COVID, when most of us have been at home. So there's reduced targets, and yet we've still seen increases. So that is all concerning. All right, let's turn to violent extremism and some definitions. There are multiple definitions in the government for terrorism. I've just chosen one here to give you a picture. There's different, you'll hear these different terms. I think most people intuitively know what terrorism is, but generally speaking, it's an act of violence to intimidate or coerce for whatever your ideological aim is. So doing an act to further your ideological goal, whether it's because you support ISIS or Al Qaeda, or you want to save the environment, or you want a white nation state. Like the ideology is kind of, it's a core part of the definition, but it's the act of violence in order to intimidate, coerce, that is what makes it terrorism. Hate crimes there can be an overlap between hate crimes and terrorism. Person or property, or crime against a person or property motivated in whole or in part by the offender's bias against race, religion, disability, sexual orientation, ethnicity, gender, or gender identity. Targeted violence, again, there can be some overlap here, but the concept is not necessarily tied to ideology. It has more to do with, think workplace violence. So there's a grievance, or the individual wants to commit suicide by cop. They pick a place intentionally. It's premeditated. It's not random. It's not like somebody snaps. It's premeditated, and they pick a place based on some sort of grievance to carry out that act of violence. May or may not have an ideological influence. And I think what's important with all of these terms is you often will see the person behind the podium at the FBI or the White House. This is an act of terrorism. This is a hate crime. Definitions really do matter when you are investigating and prosecuting. They matter less when you're meeting the victim face to face. When I was at DHS, we actually opened our aperture and made the point to say, like, we're trying to prevent all of the violence, because sometimes we don't even know what motivated an individual. I'll give you the example of Las Vegas. Do you remember in 2017, October of 2017, shot from a hotel room, killed, it's probably one of the largest attacks we've had on our soil, never declared an act of terrorism because they couldn't determine motive. So to every one of those people in that concert crowd, or to the families who lost somebody, that clearly was terrifying, and yet by legal definition, not an act of terrorism. So definitions matter, but maybe not as much in terms of you look at trying to prevent, you're just trying to prevent that individual from carrying out the act of violence. Threat actors, these are the two primary groupings that you will hear about from the US government. You have the international terrorism, they still exist. They've also been affected by COVID. We have done a good job of pushing our borders out, making it harder for them to get here, but we just had an attack. They're still investigating and trying to figure out the individual's motives, if there's any ties to a foreign terrorist group. We don't think so, but he might have been influenced by them. So still have to worry about international terrorism, but as we will see, domestic terrorism has become more of a concern in the last 5 years. And I just will flag that we call it domestic terrorism. Largely, when you think of that word, you think Oklahoma City bombing, and that's an accurate way to think of it. But there is also increasingly this movement of anti-government extremism and white nationalist or white supremacist is transnational. So we have groups like the Azov Battalion in Ukraine. There are US-based individuals that have actually traveled to Ukraine to train. We have an attack in Norway. Anders Breivik, who actually was in court this week on parole, a parole hearing, but he killed 77 people in 2011. Most of them were children attending a summer camp. His motivation was to push back against multiculturalism. He was fearful of a Muslim invasion, and he wanted to preserve a white Nordic culture. His manifesto, language from his manifesto, has shown up in multiple terrorist manifestos since, including the Christchurch shooting in 2019 and the El Paso Walmart shooting in 2019. This movement of fear of the Great Replacement is transnational. The term was actually coined by a French man in 2011. So when you think domestic terrorism, don't assume it's entirely domestic. These are the categories that the government uses to define the different violent extremist movements. The two biggest are the ones at the top, the racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. That includes white supremacists, but it also includes other violent extremists that are ethnically or racially motivated. There are very few, but some examples of Black supremacist extremism, or there's a particular sect of Black Judaism that committed an act of violence in 2019. So every once in a while you get a different category, but by and large, the white supremacist movement is the largest category out of the REMV. Anti-government and anti-authority extremist, this includes militia and anarchist extremist. You'll often hear about Antifa. Antifa would fall under here, although they are not technically an organization. So that poses some challenges when you're trying to do a good job of explaining groups and movements. And you see down at the bottom, there are other categories. You probably are aware of some of these. Involuntary celibate is a rather growing category. It is very, it is usually a male that feels like they are demasculated. They don't have the ability to attract a female, and they find these other communities online who are lamenting that they can't find a girlfriend, and it turns dark and violent, and some have committed acts of terrorism. The recent shooting in Denver has aspects of an incel ideology, but it also kind of mixed with a white nationalist and a different type of more masculine ideology. So that leads me to this last bullet, the overlapping salad bar ideology. Everybody wants to know, like, how, what was their motivation? And the reality is that with the internet, everybody is able to go out and make their own ideology. So that we are increasingly seeing a mixing and a blending. You'll see a white nationalist, and this happened in the El Paso shooter. He was worried about the Great Replacement, and he was worried about the polluting of the earth. Like, so he was an environmentalist, and a white nationalist. And maybe 20 years ago, you would think, well, those are in different parts of the political spectrum. It is less about right and left and more just people picking their own ideology. Now, ideology can be important, but one, it's difficult for the government to address ideology because ideology is protected by the First Amendment. But two, as we will see, we're 20 years in to countering terrorism, post 9/11 research, trying to understand motivations. What we find is that these grievances, these ideologies, actually are not what causes somebody to move into the group. So they are tools. They're tools for recruitment, but they're not necessarily the reason why somebody decides to go commit an act of terrorism. These are some examples of primary domestic terrorism grievances. I hope one of the things that you see is that many of these are very legitimate topics of conversation in our public square. And that's where when disinformation enters in, it becomes easier to recruit people in. So if you're somebody that's worried about immigration, and then you have additional disinformation enter in to that conversation with somebody online, but your grievance or your concern is we don't have strong enough borders, and maybe you have some very legitimate experience. You're living on the southern border, and you've seen the challenges posed by migrants coming through, needing help, needing medical care, impacting the economy. So maybe you have very legitimate things that in the context of our democratic republic, you as a citizen absolutely have a right to raise your hand and say, hey, this is not working. We got to fix this. But then you have, unbeknownst to you, radical voices online trying to exploit that grievance with you, and telling you things that aren't actually true. It can take somebody down a radicalization path pretty quickly. But we actually see, in my work with Moonshot, we look at the online spaces where these conversations are happening, and we actually see extremists plotting amongst themselves about how to take common political dialogue. Okay, right now it's CRT. CRT is the conversation. How do you take that and use that as a recruitment tool to their more violent, extreme views? They're very smart in how they approach. They don't walk up to you and say, I think we need to overturn the US government and establish a white nation because that's the only way we get back to what's good about this country. They would never do that, right? Because you're going to hear that and go, okay, you're crazy, I'm gone. They spend months grooming you, just like a sexual predator does, months grooming you. And then it's only after you've built a relationship with that person that you might discover that, in fact, their aim is to overthrow the US government and establish a white nation, which is kind of the core premise for white supremacism. So One more slide on the number of terrorist attacks since 1994. This comes from CSIS. What I just want you to see in a quick snapshot is that the number of attacks and plots by far right, this is how CSIS characterizes it. So that's going to include your anti-government and your racially and ethnically motivated violent extremists. So the number on the far right far exceeds any other category, including ISIS and Al-Qaeda. That would be in a religious grouping, including Antifa or anybody on the far left. And then you see dramatic spike, an upward trend post 2013, but a dramatic spike in 2020. How do they recruit? We covered some of this already. One of the things that is most concerning to counterterrorism professionals these days is this, what we call the Overton window shift. Conversations that used to only happen on the fringes in political parties or in polite conversation are now increasingly a part of the mainstream. You have Tucker Carlson talking about the Great Replacement, and granted, he's careful how he frames it, so it's not overtly the same thing that the white nationalist movement or the terrorists in El Paso, the way that they use the term, but nonetheless, he's using the same term and planting the seed that you, a white person, should be upset that your power is being taken away from you. And the logic trail there, maybe Tucker doesn't have to say it, but others will fill in the gap after Tucker says, oh, we're being replaced. Well, if you want to stop it, and this is an existential threat, we're all being replaced, you have to do something about it. So that you have these other voices that come in while somebody's talking, they're on Gab, they're talking about like what Tucker said that night. And then you have another voice that comes in, well, there's something that you can do about it. You can join our movement. You can protect your community. You can protect your family. What about your grandkids? We see that happen all the time. And when people have resilience factors, protective factors, they're not going to be pulled in. But the problem is we have a pretty large number of vulnerable individuals right now in our country, and they are being exploited. The recruitment is through memes, it's through games. There are YouTube cooking shows where they will take you through, cooking something, and it's not until the third or fourth episode that you start to hear some of the white nationalist rhetoric. There are groups out there now intentionally establishing political parties. So they're using the legitimate political process to move into more mainstream political conversations. And then, of course, they leverage the conspiracies and disinformation. In fact, in the last year, one of the trends that we have seen after January 6th failed as a Stop the Steal movement, we're increasingly see some of those same conspiratorial voices gravitate towards COVID being their political cause and promoting disinformation around that. Last thing before we move into the why now of radicalization, I want to kind of just give you a sense of when we talk about disinformation campaigns, there are different types of different disinformation campaigns. There are the types that flood the zone with so much conflicting information that it leads the listener or the reader to paralysis. Who can tell what is true? It undermines your confidence of being able to tell the truth. And I give you a few examples here on the screen. Increasingly, I would argue that moderate Americans, people who, they might vote with Dems or Republicans, but they're not the loud political voices. So I call them moderate, not in a political sense, but moderate in a temperament sense. Increasingly, they're just checking out, right? Like they're like, I don't know who to believe. You all seem crazy. And so they check out. The problem with them checking out is it allows those loud voices to become more dominant. And there's no moderating tone of like, there's probably a way to understand both sides here, right? So the distraction campaign has been very prominent in the United States and very effective. And as you can see, also things that we are seeing some of our competitors or enemy foreign states use. Persuasion campaigns are a little different. This is what we saw occur in the 2016 election and probably continued in the 2020 election. Russia, through their troll factory, created pages that pretended to be different activists, so Black Lives Matter activists, or there's some data I'll show you that shows they targeted the Christian church. They embedded themselves for years. It didn't start in 2016. It was something they started many, many years ago, such that when 2016 comes around, an American has a relationship in this group with people that are actually, in fact, Russian trolls. So when that Russian troll voice, let's call her Susie, says, well, gee, this sounds like X, Y, and Z, you don't think anything of it because you've been talking to Susie for years. Meanwhile, Susie is getting her direction from the Kremlin, saying, make sure that you push people in this direction. So we have documented episodes throughout the Black Lives Matter protests in I want to say it was 2015. We saw it repeatedly in the 2016 election, and we've continued to see it ever since. So they got the old adage of you don't know who you're talking to. I think we all used to think that was like, oh, somebody's gonna run a scam on you. Well, no, it was a foreign government trying to run a scam on the entire country. And while this has been reported, I don't think, based on conversations with my family members, I don't think that is well understood. I don't know that the American people as a whole understand that a foreign government actively set up a scheme to be able to lead people down a path of outrage for things that turned out, didn't require the outrage or weren't true. So let's now talk about why we are where we are. I'm going to breeze through these so we can get to more action steps. I don't have to tell you guys how difficult 2020 and 2021 have been, but from a radicalization perspective, and violent extremism perspective, when we look at people that have committed attacks, this like a historic look back, 40 years of people that have committed attacks, we know that significant life stressors are usually in their background. So financial stress, isolation, fear, uncertainty, loss of a loved one, all of those usually, in somebody that has committed an attack, have occurred in the last 2 to 3 years prior to them committing that attack. We just put the entirety of society through a significant stressor, some more than others. Now, that does not mean the entirety of society is going to go become a terrorist, but it does increase vulnerability for a certain subsection of our population. And where if you're in my job 2 years ago, you're worrying about domestic violent extremist groups, now I'm worried about that and the entirety of society who you just don't know which person is going to be the person that is the one that moves into this violent movement. QAnon goes mainstream. Anybody that says QAnon is not associated violence hasn't actually looked at the data. While they're not a traditional violent extremist group, members have, and I'm just giving 2 examples here, but there are multiple examples of members committing acts of violence. And the members thought, the people thought that they were saving the children. So definitely QAnon really broke reality for many people. And then we had obviously the intense election. I work for Moonshot. This is a slide from them. They work to combat online harms like terrorism and human trafficking. We monitor search content, and what we saw in April 2020 when the pandemic started was a 37% increase in searches for hate content. That alone was rather startling, but then the data came out the next year that over the year period, it had increased 140%. So these are people that are not like curious, like, what is a white supremacist? It's not that. It's how do I join a neo-Nazi group? How do I join the Boogaloo Boys? I won't go into how we figure out what's what in search terms, but trust me when I say 140% increase is rather concerning. The other concerning thing that really was solidified by what happened on January 6th of last year is the nature of the makeup of who was there on January 6th. This data comes mostly from the University of Chicago's Project on Security and Threats. They released their data in August, but I've updated it with some stats that are more recent. So 700 have been arrested. There were 10,000 people there that day. Let's start with that. 10,000 people were at the Capitol. There were 700 that have been arrested so far. They are from 44 of 50 states. They're all over. But only about 64, and by the way, we keep getting indictments, so this number keeps changing, but about 64 of those indicted so far were affiliated with what we would consider an organized extremist group. Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, 3%ers, Aryan Nation, that kind of stuff. So that's a relatively very low number compared to those that have been arrested. So what the University of Chicago is suggesting is that while we still have to worry about organized groups, and certainly I don't want to undermine, like we had seditious conspiracy charges dropped for the first time in several decades against Oath Keepers last year for their role in what happened on January 6th. Like they were critical to creating some of that violence. So I don't mean to minimize them. But what the University of Chicago is suggesting we need to be mindful of is that we actually have a violent mass movement on our hands. This is different than an organized extremist group. Other things that make the January 6th people different, the average age of those that have been indicted are 39. That is way higher than our average violent extremists, which tend to be in their teens, late teens or early 20s. They are business owners, they're white collar, meaning they are economically more advantaged than our average terrorists. So one of the things when you look at the data is this sense that we can't use the same tools that we were using previously for violent extremist movements to address what is going on here. We need to better understand the motivations, how somebody shows up at the Capitol or the White House for a rally and then decides, you know what, yeah, everybody else is going to go commit acts of violence and beat up police officers. I'm going to join in. It might have been a split-second decision for many of them, and yet you had to be primed to get to that place where you're somehow in your head, it's okay to beat up a police officer. So one of the things from the University of Chicago's research, and I can't go into the full depth because we're running up on time, but one of their primary drivers was fear of the Great Replacement. So it was this idea that the rights of the minorities are being overtaken or are overtaking that of whites. And they controlled for a number of factors in that. And that was one of the findings of the people that were there on January 6th. They did a poll, scientifically based poll. 21 million Americans believe the election was stolen and violence was justified to fix it. And of those 21 million, 1 million of those are part of or know somebody who is a part of an extremist movement. There have been numbers since June that indicate that it's more like 30 to 33 million Americans believe that violence might be justified for political means. By the way, that is the definition of terrorism. I have to tell you that when I was serving in government 2 years ago, I once asked for an estimate on how many violent extremists we have in the country, and the max number that anybody would tell me is 100,000. To say that there are 1 million people that know or know someone or are themselves a part of a violent extremist movement is mind-boggling. Or put it another way, if I were to tell you there are 1 million Al-Qaeda and ISIS people embedded in the United States, wouldn't we all panic? Now, just because you have people involved in those movements, just because you have people that even tell you 33 million think that violence could be justified in certain circumstances, does not mean they're going to go commit that act of violence. But it has created a pool of what I would consider radicalized so much larger than we've had before. And it's usually just a small percentage that commit those acts of violence. But when you have a huge pool, you're going to have more acts of violence. So that is our concern. Real quickly, post January 6th, we've had some new data come out over the last year. Analysts are saying the threat is not greater or less, but it is different and evolving. A lot of national groups have dispersed to focus on local groups. They have a lot of offline gatherings instead of online. There are a variety of reasons for that, including law enforcement investigations, and the fact that a lot of them were deplatformed. Deplatforming worked kind of. We can get into that if anybody has questions on that. And then we've already talked about mixing of causes. Radicalization. The radicalization process is where an individual comes to believe that the threat or use of unlawful violence is necessary or even justified to accomplish a goal. The mobilization to violence is where somebody is actually starting to take action. Now, why is that important? Because you use different tools at different points in the spectrum. So you have a vulnerable population. These are people not radicalized, but for whatever reason, factors in their life, stressors, lack of significant belongings in community, they are vulnerable to somebody recruiting them. And then you have the radicalization process, radicalized individuals, and then that mobilization to violence. Now, here's what I want you to see, because it's a very busy graph. It's something that we designed for work I was doing at DHS. The key here is that on the far right of this graph, leading up to an attempted attack, that is law enforcement's jurisdiction. That is, criminal line has been crossed, law enforcement can engage. Everything before that, law enforcement is not allowed to really address in this country. There are efforts underway to try to create government prevention capability that would be non-law enforcement. It's about creating better mental health access, identifying people that could potentially be a threat and getting them help before they are actually the threat. All of that's important. But the further left you go on this graph to where you get to that vulnerable population, the more it is better for everyone that help come not from government. And that's where I see you all having a super important role. If we can reduce vulnerability, make that box much smaller, we're all going to be better off. If we are equipped to know how to intervene when somebody is in a radicalization process, we're going to be better off. And if somebody is radicalized, we still need to be able to help them. And I think the church can help, but that's where those partnerships with law enforcement, with mental health professionals become really important. This was that Facebook slide I mentioned to you, that there was some internal research got leaked last fall, that Facebook was testing their algorithms, and they found that in 2 days, Facebook was recommending groups dedicated to QAnon when, and actually the profiles they were using were like, a Christian mom who's interested in, homeschooling her kids and, organic foods. And in just 2 days, without them touching it, they weren't active. In 2 days, the Facebook feed was recommending groups related to QAnon. Within 5 days, their feed was filled with extreme conspiratorial and graphic content. The algorithm literally created the echo chamber. So part of what's so depressing about the moment that we're in is like, we know this, Congress is asking Facebook to fix it. Facebook is asking Congress to regulate it. Nobody's actually doing anything to fix this. And meanwhile, the problem still exists. So that's not to say that if you have the right resilience factors, you couldn't appropriately recognize what's going on and say, like, this is nuts. I don't want to see this. But for so many over the last few years, like, we didn't know that this was happening. And so you would just check in with your friend that you hadn't seen in a week. And then all of a sudden they're talking about things that, you're like, Q, what? And what are you talking about? Child, sex trade. Like, this is weird. Like, how did you find this? And it was Facebook. So that I think is rather alarming. Intentional foreign attack. We've talked about most of this, but here's the other Facebook thing, that Christian and Black American content was being run by an Eastern European troll farms. The most popular pages were not being run by anything here or actually legitimate Christians. It was Russians. 140 million Americans monthly were touched by these pages. The largest Christian American pages on Facebook were 20 times larger than the next largest groups. They reached 75 million users monthly, 95% of whom never followed any of the pages, meaning you don't even have to proactively go look for it. It comes to find you. So that's what we're up against. Let's talk about prevention protective factors. I'm not going to read all of these for you. You can read them. But I hope that after what we've talked about with this idea that you, the church, us as believers have this unique answer to many of the big questions in life, like what is my purpose in life, and am I loved? Do I have meaning? We address that every day and in various forms and factors. And now you have research that's backing up that the way that you reduce vulnerability is helping people answer those questions. Nuance is super important. Obviously, parental involvement is a key factor in people that have resilience to the radicalization. One more thing. So let's assume you've got somebody in your congregation that you would consider radicalized or on that path. We in Moonshot, we were running some campaigns. We've done this overseas for Buddhist violent extremism, which is such a thing. I didn't know until I joined Moonshot that was a problem. We've done it for European audiences. We've done it domestically here in the United States. What we found when we run campaigns for individuals that are searching for content related to anything violent far right is that they are 48% more likely to click on something that is self-help and social service content. And users looking to join or engage the organization are 115% more likely to click on it, meaning than the average person. So what this tells us is that there is more interest in the empathy message, or the and here are some examples of some de-escalation messages that Moonshot has used. We're all in this together. Take a deep breath. You're frustrated. We hear you. That empathetic response to anger was one of the top messages that was responded to. So just a little bit of evidence for you when you're doing the hard work of empathy, because it is hard. The data shows us it does work. I didn't say this on the outset with radicalization, but both radicalization and de-radicalization, it's not linear. You could think somebody is on the verge of doing something and then they back way off, and then all of a sudden 5 weeks later, boom, it's there. So even though we showed that graph, that's really more to help you understand the different stages somebody could be, but they can jump from one to the other and back. It's humans, we're complex. But here's some key things I would love for you all to take to heart, that the empathy and love that the church can offer may be a critical part of helping somebody de-radicalize. And this we've covered at the beginning, so I'm kind of back to where we started, and I would love to take your questions. I know we've gone longer than I aimed for, but Napp, over for you.
Yes, thank you. One of the things that came to mind for me as you were talked about the role of churches, and at that first part, reaching the vulnerable population before it gets to a situation where law enforcement is needed. And so that's something that the church is already familiar with as far as reaching vulnerable populations. But that's often thought of in terms of orphans, widows, poor people, things like that. The vulnerable population we're talking about isn't necessarily any of those. It could be, someone from a seemingly healthy home. And so it may not be sort of the typical way that churches think about reaching people.
Yeah, no, I think you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you framed it that way, because the vulnerable in this case are not necessarily going to be aware that they're vulnerable, and in fact, given some of the dynamics that the right and the church have gotten into, they're popular. This idea of being exemplifying strong masculinity, or taking charge of, there's an authoritarian streak that has become quite popular in certain parts of the church, and that in and of itself creates some challenge. And like, how do you approach somebody? Like they say one thing, they project this image of they have it all together, they're in charge. And in fact, they've been saturated with messages from, quite frankly, I sat through sermons, so some of it does come from pastors, but certainly the media, that their way of life is being threatened, that their grandchildren are not going to be able to worship God freely if they don't do something. And they are not in control. They're actually fearful. They're operating from a place of fear, and that authoritarian strong man, it's a mask to help them survive. And by the way, they've been told all their life that's what a good man is supposed to be. So it could create some challenge to approach, because they're not going to know that they're vulnerable. They're not going to realize that they are being recruited. And so educating people about the fact that, there are some really dangerous groups out there. I mean, there's two problems here, right? Like there's the what the Chicago University of Chicago study showed is a mass violence movement that tends to be much more in the political realm, where you have certain voices saying, hey, you need to go do something. You need to show up at your state capitol with your weapons and tell them you're not, like, and those types of things, they're unwise, not necessarily what a believer is called to do, but they're not necessarily a premeditated plan of violence. It's just that the violence might occur by accident or through provocation. And then you have the violent extremist movements who actually have as their stated aim to kill other people, kill government, kill people of a different race, and they are seeking a new society through violent means. That in my mind is much darker, right? Because it's people are premeditating. This is where you end up with explosives being used and a large amount of life lost. Whereas mass political violence movements tend to, not that they couldn't have some life lost, it just the numbers tend to be smaller. The violence tends to be more against icons and institutions, as opposed to taking down entire buildings. So both are dangerous, and we have to approach them slightly different. The biggest concern I have right now is that somebody that's already in that mindset of like, yeah, you're right, there might be a time where I have to take up arms to defend my rights, in that mass political violence movement, they become much more vulnerable to be recruited to something darker, like one of those violent extremist organizations.
There was also a question about whether the slides would be available. Some of those are, I know some of those belong to Moonshot, or we'll be able to put them somewhere for people, or?
Yes, I'm happy to share the slides.
Okay, great. And are you able to read the Q&A, or should I read them out loud?
Oh, I can read them. Let's see. Austin asked, are there signs that church leaders can look for in terms of identifying someone who is being radicalized in our communities? Yes, great question. Let me flip back to one of my backup slides here. So we've done a lot of research on people that have committed attacks. So this is backwards looking historic, that things can always change. So the FBI and the Department of Homeland Security have research arms, science and technology divisions that spend a lot of time trying to understand both history and current trends. But this slide gives you a list of potential indicators. And there's actually an entire book that I could, maybe Napp, I'll send to you, but there's a book that the FBI and DHS put out, signs and indicators of somebody mobilizing to violence, that could be helpful. Let's see, next question. Austin asked, how explicit should we be about the reason for implementing or focusing on these preventive measures? Do we need to implement these things quietly or be upfront about our concerns about disinformation and extremism? Honestly, I think you probably know your community best. There's there are certainly communities that I've spoken to pastors of communities where it seems like it would be entirely reasonable to be fairly direct about the concerns. There are other communities where the moment, for example, the moment you bring up January 6th, they're going to tune you out. So follow Jesus's advice, be wise as serpents, innocent as doves, and figure out what messaging is going to be most likely to allow somebody to hear you out. I think some churches just rightly focus just on preaching the text of the scripture, and that matters. Like I said, if we had better grounding in what slander and gossip and bearing false witness is, and that like, oh no, that's like still a sin we will be held accountable for before the judgment seat of Christ, like that. I think that simple conviction helps, correct those who are, those are fully down a rabbit trail. You're not going to bring them back with that message, but many of us slide into that, just kind of not realizing that's what we're doing, not realizing that we're participating in something that God says is not good and is being part of the darkness. So again, I would go back to know your audience, and I think for many churches, January 6th is probably not the topic to bring up, but certainly you can look at other data that I've presented, or in the notes you'll see links to other studies that can also back you up. There is plenty of evidence. We're seeing more violence and more hate crimes now. Honestly, usually if you were going to present this information and express concerns about these groups, one of the things you're likely to hear is the whataboutism of what happened in the police, what happened to police during the 2020 summer of civil unrest. And I actually was watching a hearing, I want to say it was last Monday or Tuesday. It was kind of on what happened on January 6th. It was the Senate, if anybody's interested in watching it, Senate Judiciary, but it will give you, if you're not up to speed on what the talking points are on both sides of January 6th, that will give you a quick snapshot of how the different sides are talking about January 6th. In particular, what you see out of the Republicans is an emphasis on, okay, yes, January 6th was bad. We don't want that to happen again. But how come you, the Justice Department, that's who was testifying, how come you haven't done anything about the riots that occurred in 2020, which is, by the way, not true. The Justice Department also did a lot of things related to prosecuting the perpetrators of the riots of 2020. So if you were to bring it up, I think you just want to be prepared that you are likely to get this counter reaction of, well, what about Antifa? What about Black Lives Matter? And I think there are plenty of political commentators out there and counterterrorism experts who answer that question. I don't know that every pastor or lay leader needs to be an expert in those. I think your role is to preach the gospel and keep us focused on Jesus. So if you're interested, you can go that deep, but I also want to encourage you that you don't have to be an expert in all of these nuanced arguments. You can say like, hey, can't we condemn violence on both sides? Like no violence is okay. And my point is that those organizations are probably not recruiting you. The neo-Nazi groups and the Oath Keepers, we know are recruiting from our side. And so that's why we're talking about it. So just, I would be equipped with answers for the potential questions you might get. And I'm happy if you know specifically those questions that you're going to get, I'm happy to help you craft those answers. Let's see, this question comes from Scott. if January 6th were only about the election and a preferred candidate, I might be willing to dismiss a leader at another church's characterization of the day as a one-time event by a bunch of knuckleheads. But the University of Chicago tells us, study tells us something much deeper and longer is going on. Particularly, they're finding that the single most common factor of those arrested on January 6th was their living in counties that experienced a significant and rapid increase among non-whites. That finding ties in with the Great Replacement you referred to and a fear of immigration being the most important issue of the 2016 election. The question, given the much deeper long-term cultural shifts going on, where by 2050 we will be a majority minority country, how do you suggest Christians deal with the real underlying issues? Some Christians celebrate diversity, Revelation 7:9, but how do we do that beyond preaching to that choir? Scott, you've like hit the nail on the head of the key issue, right? I'm so glad you just kind of came right out and said it. A lot of what our communities are grappling with is based in reality, meaning the demographics of our country are changing, and whites will not be in the majority by 2050. Like, that's true. That doesn't mean that there's this massive orchestration to replace us. That does not mean that we're doomed to minority status in terms of not being able to have a voice in our democratic republic, that somehow we're all going to be thrown in jail. That and sometimes when you hear people talk about the demographic changes, the implications are that stark. The implications are that I frequently hear that we will not be able to worship God the way that we have for 200 years. We will basically we're losing power. There's a podcast that I got the opportunity to participate in, Brad Edwards and Bryce, and I'm blanking on Bryce's last name, but it's Everything Just Changed. And they're doing a series right now exploring the concept of power and the role that power has, and when it's abused, and how do you be a good steward of power. Highly recommend it, because I have found the conversations fascinating. But there is no doubt that part of what we are watching happen in our country, the polarization, the media dynamics, the violent extremism, like it is about people feeling like their power is being lost. So remember at the beginning, I talked about the role of belonging and significance, that all of the studies about terrorism, why people join terrorist groups, we used to think, well, it's because the Quran tells them to commit violent jihad, or it's because there's an economic inequality and they're poor, and that's why they go join terrorist groups. It's not that religion and economics can't play a part of it, but it's not the core underlying factor. And so, secular researchers that have been studying this, the foreign terrorist problem, looking at domestic terrorists, why people join militia groups, the white power movement, all that. Like, the underlying piece of it is there's some sense that your significance, it has been stolen or damaged. You've been embarrassed in some way. Your power has been taken from you. You've lost control, and you don't have strong community ties. You don't have that sense of belonging, that you matter to somebody. And so moving to these groups, they give you that sense of belonging. They also give you a mission that gives you a sense of significance. So right now we have a dynamic of the media repeatedly telling people that they need to be fearful, that they're going to lose something. They're going to lose their country. It's the most consequential election of our lifetime. We're going to lose our ability to worship freely. We're going to lose our power. The left, the power centers on the coast, they're coming after us in Middle America over and over and over again on repeat. For somebody that is vulnerable, who have lost sight of what what scripture tells us. I'm talking about a believer, I'm not talking about a non-believer, but for a believer who has lost sight of what scripture clearly teaches us, that our hope is not in anything earthly. Our hope is in Christ alone. Like, we live in a really great life. America is awesome. I wouldn't want to live anyplace else. I love my country, but none of that is promised to us as a believer. So that doesn't mean I can't still work to preserve my country and do what I think is best for my country, but it also means that it shouldn't be existential to me if I see my country going down a direction that concerns me or that I disagree with. And the problem we have in the church is we have too many people listening to voices who, quite frankly, are just, they're trying to make money off of them. They don't actually care about what they're promoting is the existential threat. But we have a mass number of people who have bought into this idea that we are in danger and our country is at risk. The country, the life we know and we love is at risk. And so when things become an existential threat, that is when people feel like they have no choice but to become violent. So the lack of connecting and understanding the big picture of who you are in Christ, how this all ends, like a messed up eschatology that says that somehow we have to build the kingdom here now, like all of that would feed into the potential for somebody being recruited into something that says, yeah, we need to commit acts of violence. So to inoculate against that, or to help, pull people back from a radicalization pathway, like go back to the scriptures. Yes, you're correct. The demographics are changing. You're correct that the way that your grandchildren grow up is going to look very different than the way you grew up. That doesn't have to be something we fear. We are not called to be people of fear. And that at the same time, if you want to go protest, or if you want to vote for a candidate that you think is going to preserve certain values, I'm okay with that, as long as the preeminent value is I'm a child of God, and he is where my hope is, not trying to fix something here on earth. And so I really think a greater, deeper appreciation for the Imago Dei, for the fact that, those people over there that you have been told to demonize, no, they're children of God too. They might be lost and in need of the gospel, but they are made in the image of God. So they deserve to be treated with dignity. Even if you disagree with them, even if you think they're out to get you. I mean, I cannot read the New Testament these days, and I haven't found one place, maybe I'm wrong, you guys are probably more expert than me. I haven't found one place where Paul says to go get those Romans. I find a ton of places where Paul says to the church to hold accountable those that are the wolves in sheep clothing, or preying on vulnerable. Sure, like Jesus has some harsh words for the Pharisees. Jesus never said go after Rome. In fact, said the opposite. Said, I'm not here to do that. That's not my purpose. So I would love to see more preaching and teaching. And sometimes it can be overt, and sometimes, just let the Spirit of the Lord work, because just by preaching, you have no idea how the Spirit might convict that person of realizing that they have been making an idol out of their politics, an idol out of their country. Like, so much of this is idolatry and power. And if we just keep going back to let the scripture do that conviction, let the scripture give us the hope, so that we don't have to fear, that is going to create, that is the most amazing service that you could offer our country right now, is to preach the truth, keep people going back to the scripture, encourage people to read it for themselves, cover to cover, not just, the coffee cup verses, the whole thing. Let the Spirit do his job of conviction. But man, this is long work, guys. It's not, the mess we are in now is generational. So I don't see this getting remarkably better. I think getting out of the pandemic helps a lot, but I'll go back to that metaphor. The forest has been burned down. We're still trying to stop the fire. Let's get the fire stopped. But now we've got to recreate community. We've got to recreate institutions that people can trust. That's going to be a long, long part of work.
Yeah, thank you for that, Elizabeth. I know a lot of pastors are probably on the call right now. And just to let you know, if you don't already, we have a private group for pastors on Facebook, and we are continuing to develop resources. And so for resources that you need, we just need to know what you need, right? So let's continue this conversation. Please keep in touch with us as far as what you are finding helpful, what would be helpful for you, maybe for future webinars. Do you, for instance, is updating your processes for active shooter situations? Is that something that's needed, or do you have that in hand? I mean, I don't really know the answers to what your needs are. I just need to hear from you all. So let's continue to keep in touch, continue this conversation, and thank you all very much for joining us.